Welcome to Words to Action. My name is Ken Gordon, and today we have another very special episode where we talk about something that makes a big difference to every single one of us, and that is our public schools. Public schools in America, a race to the bottom. You know, right now there's a lot of conversation going on about charter schools, a conversation going on about private schools. Where should you put your children? Where should we put our children? Anymore nowadays, the choices are not really great. Put them in private school, but that costs an arm and a leg. Put them in charter school, but you have some good ones, some bad ones. But anymore nowadays, people are like, oh, don't leave them in public schools, because the public school education in America is not seen as competitive any longer. Well, today we have two educators that are going to talk to us about public schools, what's wrong with them, what's right with them, and how we as everyday Americans can do something to make them better. But as I often do, I want to give you a quote today, one that is actually found in the paper that was written by one of our guests. Now, it's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, but our guest actually quoted it, and I think it's extremely appropriate. It goes like this: "You deplore the demonstrations that are taking place, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express similar concern for the conditions that brought about those demonstrations. I'm sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with the effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes." That was from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think it's extremely appropriate because we want to talk about public schools and the public school education and what's wrong with it, but we really don't address the underlying causes that make it what it is. We're going to address those today on Words to Action. Our first guest, Dr. Ken Hamilton, is going to talk about A Race to the Bottom, Public Schools in America, a paper that he wrote, and we are going to address that with him. Public Schools, A Race to the Bottom. My first guest is Dr. Ken Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is currently the superintendent of schools for the Monroe Township, or for Monroe Township. In addition, he has also been an educator in Cherry Hill, Plainfield, Newark, and West Hampton. Impressively, he was also a U.S. delegate to China to talk to the Chinese about education and public school education. Dr. Hamilton, welcome to Words to Action.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I've said many times before, you and I have had an opportunity to meet and interact in a number of different areas, and you are undoubtedly the most impressive educator that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. So it's an honor to have you here to talk a little bit about public schools, A Race to the Bottom. Now, what I find kind of fascinating is I call it Public Schools, A Race to the Bottom, but I actually coined that phrase from you in the paper that you wrote, and that paper kind of forms a construct for what we want to talk about today. And so a lot of the questions, a lot of the content of what we want to talk about really comes from the paper. So before I really kind of jump into my questions, let me ask you, what prompted you to write that paper?
First of all, thank you for having me on your show. I was writing, actually kind of venting.
Okay.
I was venting because public education was under such attack, public school teachers in particular, and I just felt like I just needed to kind of purge. Mm-hmm. And in the process of writing that article, so many things started coming into my consciousness in regards to not just public education, but the system that governs public education. And so that's how the article morphed into A Race to the Bottom. It really wasn't even entitled when I started writing it, but it kind of morphed into that.
Okay, so let's talk for just 1 second about where did the title come from?
Well, it was a spin on Race to the Top, which mm-hmm. was the president's initiative and the efforts to kind of overhaul public education, and mm-hmm. it was supposed to be this resurgence of revitalizing public education, and the fact of the matter is, as a result of a lot of the bureaucracy and politics associated with public education, in some communities it really has become a race to the bottom instead of a race to the top.
So let me in the form of qualification, and don't be offended by this question, but how many years have you been involved in public education? I'm not trying to tell your age, but
I've been in public education 27 years.
Wow, okay. So you've been around a little bit, and you've
Yes.
kind of seen a change, I'm assuming, in the way public schools are being dealt with.
The thing that's interesting about my career is I've had an opportunity to work in very poor communities, mm-hmm. very wealthy communities, mm-hmm. small schools, large school, medium-sized schools. So I've really had a plethora of experiences that I think kind of formulate and frame my thinking about public education.
So let's use that kind of as our springboard into some of the questions that I really want to get and really dig into today. First and foremost, why is public schools, or why are public schools under attack in America?
Somebody's got to take the blame. Public schools are easy targets, and I think it unfortunately serves as a scapegoat for a lot of the things that our community, our country, and even our nation is dealing with as it relates to violence with children, dropout rates, unemployment, and underemployment. And somebody's got to take the blame for it, and our schools are easy targets for our politicians.
So, and this is, I think, one of the things, and not something I told you I was going to talk to you about, but you talk about it being under attack and someone taking the blame, and as you were saying that, I kind of thought about the fact that you've been to China, you've had an opportunity to see how that system works. I've had an opportunity to go to Japan and see how that system works, Germany and a number of other places. Is there really a difference in our public schools and public schools throughout the world?
There is a difference in terms of the culture that
Okay.
shapes public education.
Okay.
In China, kids know that the only way they're going to change their social circumstances or their wealth is through education. In America, we have so many other vehicles that public education isn't seen. It isn't as valuable to kids as it is in other countries. And I think that is the basic difference between what happens in places like China, Japan, and even Korea, where I've also had the luxury of being able to go. And until we are able to change those circumstances, I think our public schools will continue to fail certain children.
So I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Okay, in America, in a lot of in the community I live in right now, you can go out on a weekend to the baseball field, to the football field, baseball diamond, football field, basketball court, etc., and you can't find a parking place because there's so many cars there, parents having their kids. But you go to a Board of Education meeting and you can pick pretty much where you want to park.
And I'll give you another analogy. Go to a graduation, and when the valedictorian and salutatorian is announced, you give them applause. Go to a sporting event and let the MVP give them. There's a standing ovation.
Right, absolutely, absolutely, and that's a really good point. So let's talk for just a second about some of the flaws. You talk in your paper about the fact that you recognize that there are some flaws in our public school education, or in public education, if you will. What are some of those flaws?
For one thing, I think we try to do too much in an antiquated system. We try to cover so many standards in so little time, and our teachers, unfortunately, are under pressure to just cover content. Other countries don't have so many standards that teachers have to accomplish in the course of a school year.
Okay.
Our teachers are going from chapter to chapter in antiquated textbooks in many instances just to cover the content, and the emphasis isn't so much on learning as much as it is on getting through. And so there are children that fall through the cracks. And we have a system that is so old in terms of how much time we devote to education. Our school calendar, for example, that we keep piling things on and on in education for teachers to do and teachers to accomplish, and we're not changing the construct in which those things have to happen.
So let me ask you a quick question, because you hit on something that I find to be kind of fascinating. What do you mean by the school calendar? How is that outdated?
Well,
Should our kids be in school less? I mean, four months out of the year?
kids need to be in school all year, frankly. 12-month
Okay.
school systems. And other countries have done that and have done it very well. And I think if we're going to continue to change standards, and there is an effort to change some of our standards, but if we're going to continue to try to be competitive with other countries, we really need to go back to that school calendar and find out what can we realistically accomplish if we're going to continue to operate in the 10-month system.
So one of the things that I find really fascinating is that you probably will not find a lot of parents who will scream too loud about a 12-month system. So why don't we have one?
Part of it is because there has to be, education is a very slow process in terms of change, and there has to be a grassroots effort to really look at what we're doing in terms of public education and how to change that, and then prepare people for it. We have to look at our schools and how many of our buildings can accommodate children 12 months out of the year, for example. We have to look at teacher contracts and what that means for school budgets. We have to look at how our principals and support staff will be compensated for 12-month calendars. It can be done, and it's happening in other places. We just have to amp up the process.
So one of the things I find really interesting that jumped out at me when I was in Japan, they have a 12-month calendar. And the kids get out for 1 or 2 weeks, and then they go back to school, and they're there for the balance of the year, if you will. And I find it fascinating that charter schools and private schools who could do that, they really don't do that either.
You know, charter schools have been invented as an alternative to public education. And it really isn't. It really is just an extension, in most instances, an extension of public schools. They get to pick their children, they get to provide the kinds of services they want to provide instead of making sure they meet the needs of all kids across the continuum, whether you're a high achiever, you're a low achiever, or students who may need additional supports because they have particular learning disabilities. But the truth of the matter is, the more and more we morph into charter schools, the more and more we're going to see more of the same old, same old.
Okay. Now, one of the things I do want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you about, you talked in your paper about a 21st century overhaul, and I definitely want to talk about what that looks like. One of the things you talk about in your papers, you talk about a 21st century overhaul, and if I'm not mistaken, the fact that you know that though the schools need them, it's probably not going to happen immediately. What exactly does a 21st century overhaul look like in education?
I think it can happen immediately. I really do. I think the way we use technology, for example, as a learning mechanism can absolutely, it's at our fingertips. We know how to use it. There are things we already know about education that we haven't really used to our advantage. For example, we know certain things about educational research. We know when children come to school with certain kinds of prerequisites or lacking those prerequisites, those kids are going to need some kind of ramp up, some kind of support system. We don't need to wait until those kids arrive at our doors to provide that.
So let me interrupt you really quickly. I need you to be a little bit more specific. So what kinds of things should kids come to school with that improves their ability to learn?
An extensive vocabulary, for example, exposure to words, exposure to print, exposure
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you one more time. I want to be really clear, and I apologize, but when you say come to school, do you mean preschool or come to school every day? I mean, which are we talking about from the time that they are 4 years old and report, or are we talking about every day when they get up and go to school?
I'm talking about readiness. That means before they are in kindergarten. These are skills or exposures that children need to have.
A big vocabulary.
A large vocabulary, exposure
from a
to
4-year-old.
print. Absolutely. By the time children leave kindergarten, they should be able to write. They should be able to write in sentences. And it's happening all across the country.
And that's realistic?
Absolutely.
Is it realistic for them to come to kindergarten already knowing how to write their name?
It does happen. Now, there are things that kids need to know in order to be ready for that, and that's the exposure. And if we know that there are children coming to us who lack those experiences because of certain demographic backgrounds, certain lack of exposure to certain things, then we know that we need to provide those kids with additional services. We don't need to wait until they're in 3rd and 4th grade to do that.
Dr. Ken, if a child comes to school, kindergarten, and at the end of the kindergarten year they can't write their name, they don't have a big vocabulary, they can't say their numbers or whatever, do you put them back in kindergarten? Do you put them in special ed? I mean, what do you do?
No, you provide additional services for those youngsters.
Okay.
There will always be gaps between children who have certain experiences and those who do not. However, we have a mechanism to make sure that we provide additional supports for those youngsters so that we are not allowing those gaps to become perpetuated throughout the school system, but rather close them up very early on.
Well, one of the things that's really disturbing to me that really kind of blew my mind is that a parent was talking to me recently about their kindergartner that was being told they were going to have to repeat kindergarten. And I thought to myself, when I think about someone repeating a grade, I don't think about that until like way down the road, 8th, 9th grade or whatever, but kindergarten, I mean, is there really a reason to make kindergartners repeat?
In my opinion, no.
Okay.
I think unless a youngster has a particular learning disability, that repeating that content is going to benefit that youngster. There are certain ramifications to retention, a lot of social ramifications to retention. So I think in extreme cases that may be necessary, but by large proportion, there are youngsters who will not benefit by being retained in primary grades like kindergarten.
So I want to just move on a little bit because there's so much in your paper. You talk in your paper about governmental dependency and how that affects public school education. Can you talk for a second about that?
I think our government has created a system that keeps people governed instead of helping people become more independent. And there are social services that
I'm sorry, hang on. I think I just heard some Republicans standing up and saying yes or pumping their fists or something. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think we get caught up in our nation between equity and equality. And there is a distinction that we have to make. Equity means that people get what they need. Equality is everybody getting the same thing. And when we look at education, we have to make sure that we are providing equity. Equality doesn't always close the gaps. Equality doesn't always create a system of people who are going to be independent. Sometimes it perpetuates dependency on government. And even when we look at funding and how our public education is funded, the government will always pour money into those schools that do not have the tax base for the communities to be able to sustain and support themselves. And unfortunately, by and large, those are the systems that generally fail our children.
So what is the answer to that then from a governmental standpoint? Is it less governmental intervention? Is it more specific governmental intervention? Is it better oversight? I mean, what is the answer to that?
I think it's increased accountability. I think it's about in my mind, what gets monitored gets done. And if the government is going to really provide the oversight that they are claiming to provide, then I think they have to also make sure that they are providing the supports that teachers need. Make sure that they are well qualified, that they're getting to professional development, that they have the resources, but also that we have instructional leaders, those people who are responsible for being administrators over our teachers, to make sure that we have a clear understanding and a definition about what quality teaching is.
So I definitely want to get into the whole quality teaching thing and talk about teachers, and that's a big issue.
Yes.
So I want to hold off before we run into that. But two things before we go there. You said what gets monitored gets done, and the way that I have always said it is people respect what you inspect, and it's the same thing. But I think that applies in this particular case too. But let me kind of turn the corner a little bit and talk about one of the kind of real big issues in education that you hear about all the time from the baby boomer generation and those beyond. And that has to do with the lack of parental involvement. A lot of people blame what goes on in education today on the parents. So talk for just 1 second about to what extent are parents to blame for the state of public schools?
I think we have to, first of all, redefine parental involvement, and I prefer to call it parental engagement.
Okay.
Because when we talk about parental involvement, I think we have a connotation, it leads to a connotation that we expect parents to be in schools every day and show up to meetings, and that's not necessarily what we're looking for. What we're looking for is parents to be engaged, and that means holding kids and teachers accountable, making sure that children have a time and a place where they have set aside priorities relative to how they prepare for school, that they're talking to teachers on a regular basis about what children are and are not doing. But more importantly, that they're providing that support so that teachers feel that they are partners in the educational process. So I don't know that parents are to blame, but I do think, and unfortunately, in many instances, parents have put the parenting of children on teachers and on schools and on public education. And I think parents have to take back that responsibility.
Recently, I was listening to Sirius XM Radio, and I was listening to a young lady named Coco Mode. And she was talking about a number of different issues in education, and one of the guests that she had on her show was a young lady who wrote a book, and I don't remember her name, but the name of the book was "I Don't Want to Raise Your Children, I Want to Teach Them." And I thought that was really fascinating because a lot of teachers feel like the raising of the kid is being left to them. Is that something that how do you feel about that?
You know what, unfortunately I think that does happen. I think there are too many instances where our teachers are expected to parent children because there are parents who are not doing that or not doing it well. We live in a nation where so many of our children are being raised in single female heads of household, and I know that's a whole nother question.
Whole nother show.
Altogether. But it's significant because our children are coming to us with such deficits, social deficits, emotional deficits, that our teachers have to be able to be a master of their craft but also be able to provide that kind of parenting that many of our children are lacking.
So I at some point after this, I'm going to write my own book, and the book is going to be entitled, I Don't Want to Teach My Kids, I Want to Raise Them. You do your job, I'll do mine. And that kind of leads me to the next issue that I want to talk to you about. And I want to talk about this whole concept of teachers and performance. It's wrapped up inside of tenure, inside of evaluations, etc. And that's really the next, topic that I want you and I to discuss. So I definitely want to talk to you about that. So one of the things that you touch on in your paper is you talk about teachers and their involvement and really how they're looked at. And that kind of brings to the forefront an issue that you hear certainly in New Jersey all the time as Governor Christie went after NJEA, talking about tenure and things like that. And regardless of where you fall on that issue, one of the absolute truths is that we've got to figure out a better way to evaluate our teachers and deal with poor performance. As a superintendent of schools, how do you deal with poor performance among teachers?
Well, one of the things that I have done in the districts where I have worked is tenure is not automatic. Mm-hmm. Just because you're there 3 years and a day does not mean that you get tenure. I've implemented something.
Is that not law?
It is law, but
Okay.
There's a process in my mind that teachers need to go through.
Okay.
Before you, in my mind, you're really saying that I'm going to be married to you for the rest of your career at that 3 years and 1 day mark. Mm-hmm. So I've always asked my principals and teachers to go through what I call a tenure defense round. And that is, tell me what you have done in the course of your 3 years that would allow me to recommend that you are granted tenure. Mm-hmm. So that means I need to know that your children are doing well, that you're not abusing sick days and personal days, that you have been involved in school, that you're not one of those teachers who punch out when the bell rings or beat the kids out in the parking lot, but that you have made a commitment to the process, the process of educating children. So whether the governor does that or not, I think our quality instructional leaders have to take responsibility for that. But ultimately, when we start talking about erasing tenure reform, we have to also look at, have we changed the conditions that brought tenure about to begin with? Tenure was granted because there were teachers who needed protection. There were women who were being mistreated in employment practices. There were minorities who were not given appropriate opportunities. So have we as a country really changed those things that brought about tenure to begin with? And if we can say confidently that we have erased those conditions, then I think we have the basis to do away with tenure.
Yeah, well, that hasn't happened. Okay, so anyway, all right. So, but let's talk for a second. So now they're tenured, and they are just not a good teacher. They don't care, and there are those out there. And with all due respect to teachers, there are some bad ones out there. What can be done about bad teachers in our public schools that have tenure?
Well, first of all, it is a minority. Most of our teachers.
I expect you would say that.
Most of our teachers are exceptional. I've never met a teacher who said, I'm going to show up today and do the worst I can do. Every teacher wants to do the best.
Okay, so my son's third grade. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But I think ultimately our teachers really do a good job. However, to answer your question, for those who do not, I think we just have to go through the process. We have to provide them with supports and provide
So
them
there
with
is a
systems.
process.
Of course there's a process. And I think that's one of the misnomers that's out there, that once you're tenured, you can't be dismissed. That is not true. There is a process. It's an expensive process, but it's not as expensive as undereducating and miseducating children.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is very true. A lot of people don't even know that there is a way and that there is a process. So again, we're going to actually post your paper on my website, and there's a lot of great information in it. But let's kind of talk for a second about solutions. Let's talk about, okay, so public schools are under attack. Parents probably are not as engaged as they could be. The governmental construct really kind of leans more towards the wrong kind of involvement and oversight versus the productive kind. All right, so we have these kinds of issues. What can we do? What can an everyday person do to help improve public school education in America?
First thing we have to do is erase the boundaries between public schools and our government or our municipalities. Because where schools are failing, the community is failing. Mm-hmm. And until we bridge the gap between school and community, we're going to continue to have failing schools. Because ultimately, no matter where children come from, they're going to all meet up in the school. No matter what their social economic background is, their demographic, their race, their ethnicity, they're going to meet up in public schools. So if we don't change the conditions in our communities by engaging, educating parents, holding our political leaders accountable so that we are working in unison, our schools will continue to fall by the wayside and our children will continue to be miseducated and undereducated. So I think one of the things that we have to do is become activists. Activists not going to board meetings and just raising hell about what boards are doing or not doing, but holding our political people accountable, understanding the power of the vote, understanding the senators, the legislators who go out there and they post these bills and come up with these policies that govern the conditions that under which our schools have to operate. That's where you get the biggest bang for your buck.
Okay. A lot of great stuff there, Dr. Ken, and certainly we need way more time to really talk about that. And one of the things that I think is commendable on your part is all of the work that you have done. A lot of groundbreaking work and a lot of very revolutionary type of work in education, and I applaud you for that. And I appreciate it. Thank you for being on my show today. Our next guest is going to be Angeline Dean, and Angeline is an educator as well, and someone who has taken a bit of a different path and approach to education in our public schools. Angeline Dean is our next guest here on Words to Action as we talk about public school education, a race to the bottom. Ms. Dean is a sought-after speaker and minister. She serves as a committee woman and a county co-chair for the Citizens Campaign here in New Jersey. In addition to that, she's a co-founder of Dynasty Consulting and a recipient of the New Leadership Award from the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers University. In addition to that, Ms. Dean also hosts her own radio program on Wi-Fi 1460 AM. The name of it is Straight Talk, Real Talk, Let's Talk with Angeline Dean, and it airs every Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Angeline, welcome to my show.
Thank you.
And I shouldn't say welcome to my show like it's mine. Anyway, it is. But anyway, okay. So, I'm joking. All right. So, thank you so much for coming on Words to Action with Ken Gordon. It's a pleasure having you today. I had the pleasure of meeting you a few weeks ago in your activist role. You had pulled together some parents in a local school district and were mobilizing them to improve public school education. So let me just kind of take a step back and ask you, because you're not a full-time educator from my understanding. So
Correct.
What exactly is your involvement in public schools?
My involvement is I serve as a substitute teacher in the public school district, and I got pretty much acclimated in that because I was doing some mentoring in that same district.
Okay. So you started off as a mentor, and then that kind of led you to actually getting into the classroom, which I find to be fascinating because most people don't jump onto a sinking ship. But you did, and you know, public school education, if you listen to many people, boy, I mean, you don't want your kids in that, and you don't want to be involved in that, but you're actually getting involved. I mean, are you okay? I mean, why would you do that?
Some people would have a nice answer for you. However, what I began to find out in the district that I serve, is one of a low socioeconomic district. It's a mixed district, actually. And what I found out was kids that look like me weren't receiving the same type of attention that was necessary. And so that kind of sparked something for me, and it just perpetuated the path.
So, okay, I get that part. So go volunteer, go be a mentor, but you actually jumped in, and you're actually a teacher. You're a substitute teacher. So you're basically an on-call educator. Why that route? Why not just volunteer?
Well, for me, it was almost like volunteering at first. And then let me say this also. I was also looking into charter schools, and I was actually even thinking about starting my own. So part of me jumping in is I wanted to see what was going on in the education system, how I could make a change if I did start my own charter school. What could I do differently to help aid our students?
And I applaud you on that, because, you know, here on Words to Action, we talk about solutions. We talk about the fact that everybody talks. I mean, you just get enough of, so much talk. but you have to take it a step beyond and get into action. You have to get into providing solutions. And I applaud you for actually being action-oriented and really providing solutions. So I commend you for that, because the only way to really make things happen and get things done, not just in education, but really anywhere, is to get involved and to be part of the solution. So I applaud you for that. All right, so now you're in it. Now you're neck deep in public school education. And because you're like kind of an outsider, talk to me for a second about your observations of public schools in America.
Like everybody says, I didn't go in there to bash teachers. I didn't go in there. I just wanted to see
But we can do that
what
if you
was
want
going
to.
on. Nah, it's not worth it. It's not
Okay,
worth it.
all right.
But I will say this, and this is where also my political part came in, is there were some things that I found out that parents and students didn't even know were their actual rights, that they had a right to write up a teacher if a teacher came at them the wrong way. And I've seen that. I've written up teachers as a substitute for not having lesson plans ready for me. How can you not have lesson plans ready for a substitute that's coming in to teach your class?
Sure.
That's unacceptable. And then I've written up teachers because of the way they harshly, degradingly spoke to children. And then these same kids, if they responded back, they're suspended. So I had an issue with that. I had an issue with one day, and this is what really just catapulted everything, when I walked in and a teacher making $90,000 a year was teaching the Civil War and slavery. And I opened the door, and confronting me at the door was literally slaves, pictures of slaves on the wall, going all the way down the hall, came across, came up, and met me back again at the front door. So I'm thinking, as an adult, if I'm walking into this, I knew how I felt when I walked into it. I can't even imagine how the kids felt. And so, of course, I went to the teacher, and first question I asked him was, let me ask you something. What was your purpose in this? And he responded that he was teaching slavery. So my question to him as an educator was, there was no way you can balance this out for our kids. They're not just slaves. Are you serious? And so then from there, one of my 14-year-old mentees, who is like the clown of our group, she laughs, she jokes, she plays all the time. And she came to me and she said, can I just really ask you a question? And I was like, sure. But I knew it was serious because she was serious. And the first question that she asked me was, am I just a slave? So I thought to myself, if this young girl is 14 years old and she's asking me that question, how many other kids in this district or outside of this district is feeling the same way? I taught a history class, and my show was called Straight Talk, Real Talk, Let's Talk. I don't lie to these kids. I let them know Christopher Columbus did not discover America. America was not lost. And I let them know what happened and what he did. We're coming here. I'm supposed to be providing you with truth in education. I'm not going to come to you and lie to you. So that was one of the things that started it. What I found was some of my Spanish children, they said, Miss Dean, we don't learn anything about ourselves all year long.
Wow.
We were slaves too. I said, well, did you even know that you owned places in the United States? You're fighting for immigration, but some of these places you owned at one time. You know, that's where you settled. And so it began the door opening, and I did have some teachers jump on the bandwagon.
Sure.
And they said to me, you know, what are some topics so that we can bring all the children to the table? And what they found out is when they started doing that, the children who were their worst shut the whole classroom down. And they made them listen, and they made them participate, because they found out, you know what, we were freedom riders, we were fighters, we were inventors, we were all these things that predate slavery, but our kids don't get that. So I'm more of a multicultural educator, because I believe if you're going to educate my child, bring everybody to the table.
Okay, excellent. So those are very profound observations, kind of from the outside looking in, and some of the things that really need to happen. So how long have you been doing this now, substitute teaching?
It's 4 years.
4 years. All right, so you've been doing this for 4 years. You've seen a number of different areas that need to be fixed. And let me just say, I kind of make light of it, and I joke a little bit, but there is no one, from my school board time to my time even right now in local politics, there's no one that is more supportive of school teachers than am I. I believe very sincerely that it is a disgrace in America to have school teachers paid at the level where they are. And yes, they get protected, yes, they get tenure, but to a degree, given the fact of what they have to deal with in their classrooms on a day-to-day basis, given the fact that we have people that dribble basketball and make millions and millions of dollars, given the fact that in America you can get into business and make just an ungodly amount of money, we need to do a better job of taking care of our school teachers. So let me just ask you a quick question when it comes to public schools as a whole, and I don't really want to talk about the teachers here, but tell me, what can we do in your mind to improve the public school education?
Again, one of the things is to bring all of the children to the table. That's the first part. When you saw me in the activist role, that was one of the questions that I went to the board and I asked the board, define culture. Culture to them means your skin color, your ethnicity. But culture is what so many of these kids are going through. Culture is, am I coming from a violent family? Am I coming from a single family where my mother's just raising me? Am I dealing with a homelessness issue? So we have to look at what exactly, many of them don't even understand what culture is.
Sure.
Then another question I had for the board was, how many of you go into each of these schools in this district and just observe what's going on?
Let me cut across you for just 1 second, because we're actually running out of time, and I like what you said. One of the ways to fix public school education is to bring all the kids to the table. I think that's critical. But I want to go back for 1 second to a statement that a young lady who was a class clown made to you. She said, "Am I a slave?" That prompted you to write a book.
Yes.
Talk for a second about your book.
My book is called Not Just a Slave. And I wrote the book, actually I was writing a whole nother book at the time. And then when she asked me that, not only did it sadden me, it angered me. Because I knew the perception of where she was coming from with the book. So what I did was I wrote a book, and in the book I talk about what predated slavery, before you even got on the boat, who you were, the inventors, the things that were going on. I would even like to do one for the Hispanic community, and I'm working with somebody now, because again, those children, even when I mentored, I said, tell me 3 things you learned at the end of the school year, to all of my Hispanics. Tell me 3 things that you learned about yourself. They looked at me just like you're looking at me right now.
So I like that. If you could just hold your book up for just 1 second. Not Just a Slave. Now, do you have a website?
www.anjelinedean.com.
So we'll get your website onto our website. We'll get a link on there so that people can go on there and see the book and purchase it. But a great book, a wonderful read, and it talks a lot. It's something for our children, and it talks a lot about what our children need to understand, that you're not just a slave. So Angeline, thank you so much for being a guest, and we welcome you back at any time. And when you get done with the other book, you let us know, and we'll have you on then.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. At the end of the day, public schools in America is a topic that all of us should find very interesting, something that all of us should get engaged with. Why? Because it's the education of our children that guarantees the success of our future. So, what exactly are the solutions to this issue? First and foremost, our parents must be more engaged. Yeah, I know it's really vogue to say that parents should come out at every board meeting, and they should go into all of the classrooms, and they should do all the different things that were done back in the 1950s. But guess what? It's not the 1950s. Parents now are struggling. Many times they have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads and just to ensure that their children have the bare necessities. Many times we think it's all about parents working just to get the bling. Sometimes it's about them working just so they can have enough to go from day to day. But still, their children are their responsibilities, and they must get engaged. And the teachers must be held accountable. It's not just the parents. It is the parents and the teachers. It should be a collaborative effort. Teachers must be held accountable. Yeah, I know that you don't want to raise my kids, and guess what? I don't want to teach my kids. So we have to work together. How about I raise my children and prepare them so that they're ready when they come to school? And how about you teach them? How about you not try to tell me how to raise my kids, and guess what? I won't try to tell you how to teach them. At the end of the day, parents must be engaged and teachers must be accountable. Then let's take a look at government. Government is too involved to a degree. What do I mean by that? I mean that we put all the onus on the government to make everything work. But at the end of the day, it's the communities that is the responsible party for our children. You can blame politicians and the government all day long. And yes, they need to be held accountable as well. But at the end of the day, it is our communities that educate our children. You know the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child? It takes a village to educate a child. In addition to that, the other thing is we've got to bring all the children to the table. We can't just have the richest of the rich children at the table. We can't just have the privileged kids at the table. We can't just have the white kids at the table. We must have African American, Latino, Asian American, Caucasians, European Americans. We have to have that patchwork quilt all at the table being educated, because in that is where the strength for this country lies. At the end of the day, public schools in America are the responsibility of our communities, our parents, our government, our politicians, and our teachers, all working together. Not demonizing anyone more than the other, but all working together, accountable, and making it happen. And on Words to Action, that's what we're asking you to do.